Welcome back to the channel, everybody. Steven here, Northwest Small Batch Brewing. And today might go a little longer than my usual video, but we'll see how it goes. I want to talk today's brew talk is about Saison beers, that style. And you may wonder, why am I talking about Saison beers? Well, I may have one coming up pretty soon. And I thought it would be nice just to put a video about the type of style of beer. And that way, when I make the beer, I don't have to go over all of that at once with you. At any rate, this is from North Coast Brewing. What I'm drinking right now, it's called Brother Thelonious Belgian Style Abbey Ale. There you go. It's not a Saison, but it is Belgian. Anyway, let's start with cheers. Let's talk about Saison. So what makes a Saison beer a Saison? Well, I mean, it's the yeast. Let's be honest. Like most beers, it's the yeast. Saison yeast is a very, what we call highly attenuated yeast, meaning it eats through sugar like crazy, which is why a lot of times you'll find people have bottle bombs when they make these and they bottle their Saisons, because they don't realize, they think the beer is done, but man, that Saison yeast is a beast, and it will just keep eating through whatever kind of sugars it can find. It goes very dry. You oftentimes get a mix with that particular yeast with, as usual, with most these kinds of Belgian types of yeast and stuff, you get really fruity esters and spicy phenols, depending on what temperature you ferment at. So one of the key things you get from Saisons are those spicy phenolic notes, right? It's the most recognizable flavor or property that you'll find in a Saison. What do I mean by spicy? I don't mean spicy like jalapeno spicy. I mean like clove, baking spice, peppery, right? That is always produced by the yeast. And in particular, like I say, Belgian or French Saison farmhouse style yeast create that sort of banana-y, clove-like essence, depending on, like I say, how warm or how cold you ferment your beer. I like to ferment colder. I'm not a huge fan of those. I don't mind it as long as it's not overpowering. I just don't want like a big mouthful of clove, you know, and spice and banana, because it's not exactly banana. It's more like, you ever had like where it says sugar alcohols are in something? Similar to that, banana-esque. It's not quite banana. All right, and speaking of banana, that's the other very common flavor with Saisons, is these fruity esters, again, that you get from the yeast. Like I say, usually banana, but some people will say it's just tropical, like lemon, orange, apricot, pear, that sort of thing you could get from a Saison yeast. As I said, Saison yeast attenuates high. It's a high attenuating yeast, meaning it has a very dry finish. A lot of times you'll have beers that you can, you know, mash at a different temperature. You get save more of the maltiness and sweetiness of the beer, but not with Saisons. Saison yeast really is a beast, and it will end up being a pretty dry beer when it comes to fermentation. Last thing I will say before I move on to my next little bit here on Saisons is another characteristic of Saison yeasts, well, beers, is really high carbonation. Because of the dry nature of the beer and the fact that the yeast just swallows up all that sugar, bottle conditioning, like I said, can end up over carbonated, and you can get geysers or exploding bottles, which you have to be careful of. But because of that, if you can avoid those two major issues, you'll get a really highly effervescent beer, which gives it a really crisp, refreshing mouthfeel because it's so dry. Generally speaking, I think you'll find that a lot of people will like to ferment their Saisons warm and wild because they want all those extra esters and clove and banana type flavors, right? Unlike a lot of ale yeasts, you know, ale yeasts prefer, say the high 60s. I like to ferment my ales at around 65. Saison yeasts thrive at a much warmer temperature than that. All right, they generally are somewhere between 65 and 85, sorry, 68, 85 degrees Fahrenheit, which is like 20 to 30 Celsius, I think. And a lot of people will push that higher because they want more of that clove and more of that banana ester. Again, I tend to ferment them on the colder side. I don't want to be overpowered by those esters. So I would ferment mine somewhere around 68 degrees, which is still a little warmer than I ferment my normal ales, but it's not as warm as a lot of people go. There is a method of brewing Saisons that brewers sometimes use called the free rise method when it comes to the temperature of your fermentation. A lot of brewers will start in the mid to high 60s, let's say, 68, like I'm talking about. And then they will let the temperature free rise over several days while it's fermenting. As you know, fermentation creates heat. So that heat is warming up the beer and it's getting warmer. It's starting at 68, but it's going to keep going up, right? On its own. Naturally, it's going to go up on its own through this metabolic heat. And that will ensure you get the best flavor with a dry finish. Again, I'm probably not going to do that when I make mine. I think I'm going to try to hold it around 68 degrees. Again, that's just my preference on the flavor profile. All right, moving on, I want to talk about something that has to do with Saisons that's kind of important to know about because it's kind of unique. It's called the diastaticus factor, or the STA1 gene. So a key distinction between your traditional Saison strains is the presence of what we call the diastaticus gene, the STA1 gene, which classifies that beer as Saccharomyces cerevisiae versus diastaticus. Oh no, we're getting into Latin here. We already talked about how super attenuative this beer is, right? This yeast. This gene, this STA1 gene, allows the yeast to produce an enzyme called glucomalase. I didn't say I could pronounce this stuff. This enzyme is capable of breaking down complex carbohydrates or dextrins that standard brewer's yeast can't do. So when I said that Saison yeast is a beast, it's because of this gene. It can actually break down a lot of sugars that normal, like ale yeast or even lager yeast, would not be able to break down and we would consider unfermentable. Suddenly, that sugar is fermentable. Well, it's fermentable for that. Because remember, Saison yeast is basically a farmhouse wild yeast. And wild yeast have things in them, in this case, this gene, that do that sort of thing. So the result is, by consuming more of these complex sugars, the strain achieves its characteristic super dry final gravity, which gives it a very low sweetness, right? They're going to be dry and not very sweet. Now, a little warning to you, okay? Well, it's great for the style, makes it a very unique style. It's considered a form of contamination in other beer styles. I'm going to say that again because this is probably the most important part of this video if you hear any of it. This gene, diastaticus, is considered a form of contamination in other brew styles because it can slowly ferment every last bit of sugar in your beer. This will potentially lead to overcarbonation or even bottle, keg explosions over time. So What does that lead me to? What this leads to is the question: if you're gonna brew a Saison, can your Saison beer basically act the same way a Brett does, in the sense of it can contaminate the rest of your brewing equipment, right? I think of three of them, right? There's the Brettanomyces, there's the what do you call it? The Lactobacillus, the sour beers, and then there's this Saison, right? So can this Saison yeast contaminate all of your equipment? Well, the short answer is yes. Yes, it can. But it's a little different. It's a little different than Brett or lactose, right? And this is because of the diastaticus gene, the STA1 gene. That's what can affect the rest of your brew house. Remember, not all Saison yeasts produce or have this gene that can basically eat all this sugar, even the unfermentable sugar. Remember, this diastaticus gene contains an enzyme called glucoamylase, and that's what eats up all that extra sugar. So you have this enzyme production, you have this delayed fermentation. So this gene and this enzyme can stick around on brewing equipment, and then you go to brew your next beer, and all of a sudden, every beer you're brewing, you don't realize it, but it has this diastaticus in it, and now all your beer is coming out super dry, and it's eating all the sugar in it. And again, you end up with overcarbonated beer that way, bottle bombs, and that sort of thing. So you want to treat Saison yeast the same way you would treat a sour beer or a wild yeast or a Brett, which is separate it from the rest of your brewery, right? Have separate brewing containers. I'm just going to get myself a bottling bucket, just a cheapy one with a spigot, and I'll get a bottling wand because I'm going to bottle all of it. None of that's going to go through my kegerator. And all of that will be separated. I'll put it away in a plastic bag and have it separate from my brewery. And if I ever make another Saison, I'll use that equipment, and I will not touch any of my other stuff with the same stuff I'm making this Saison with. So I do have a little bit of notes because I just couldn't, I don't want to forget anything. There's a lot, and I'm sure this video, even though I'm going way over my normal time frame here, I can't fit it all into one short video. So the key takeaway here is that diastaticus gene in Saison, it's easier to kill with sanitizer than the Brett or lacto that you try to keep separate, but you still have to be absolutely meticulously careful and clean about your sanitation, because every single cell surviving can cause a problem in your beer later on. Remember, we're talking about hoses, racking canes, bottling wands, keg dip tubes. I'm not even going to use a keg for that reason. Plastic equipment, which can harbor, extra cells if they have a microscopic scratch or something in them. Recommended best practices. Here we go. So if you're using a traditional Saison yeast that has that STA1 positive yeast strain strain in it, number one is use a dedicated cold side plastic fermenter, right? Use dedicated hoses, dedicated bottling equipment. Same thing like you would do if you did a sour beer. Make sure you're aggressively cleaning, right? You can use PBW for cleaning, or I use Free and Clear. And of course, your sanitizer is good. Sometimes people will say to rotate your sanitizer. A lot of us, like myself, use Star San. You also might want to rotate to some from time to time, use a chlorine-based sanitizer like diluted bleach or something like that, and then of course rinse it afterwards. But rotate those sanitizers, and you can use heat as long as the plastic is not, you can't do it with plastic. But if you have anything that can be heat treated, anything above like 140 Fahrenheit or 60 Celsius, should help to pasteurize, so to speak, that equipment. So in short, your cold side equipment is absolutely at risk of being infected if it's not thoroughly cleaned and sanitized. And I just think if you're doing a Saison, treat it like a sour, keep it separate. Now, I know I'm going long in the tooth here on this video, but I do have a couple things I want to talk about. Again, this is, let's see, actually, I think I want to talk about this first. There are different strains of Saison yeast, all right? Not every strain is the same. So if you just buy a yeast because it says Saison, you need to know a little bit more to make sure you're getting what you want. There are three main strains of Saison yeast. There's the French, the DuPont, and the Saison blend. Well, the DuPont strain is a classic strain. They list it as earthy, peppery, very complex, very notorious for being a slow, fickle fermenter that can stall before it finishes, often requiring temperatures to be ramped up to finish it dry. Examples are White Labs 565 and Y Yeast 3724. This is DuPont strain. All right. Then you have the French strain. The French strain is a workhorse. It's very reliable, very highly attenuative, as you'd expect from a Saison. Ferments very dry. It's faster than the DuPont strain, and it produces a clean lemon citrus ester and white peppery notes. I like that. To be honest with you, I like that on paper better than the DuPont strain. It should ferment more easily and give you, I think, a better flavor profile. At least what I would be looking for. Y Yeast makes one called 3711. Lallemand makes one called Belle Saison, Belle. And then there's these blends, okay? Saison blends. Oftentimes you can find a blend of 2 or more Saccharomyces strains, sometimes including the Diastaticus strain, to achieve the complex flavor of DuPont with the reliable attenuation of the French strain. So Omega makes one called Saison Stein Monster. You heard me right. Saison Stein Monster. But I'll probably be going with the Lallemand French strain myself. But you can get the blend. But just keep that in mind. When you're doing a Saison, the yeast is probably the most important thing to think about. All right, last thing here. I'm so far over. This is going to be such a long video, but I want to compare real quickly for you, just to hammer home, like I said, the most important part of this video, which is how risky is it? How risky is this strain of that has that Diastaticus gene compared to like a Brett beer or a Lacto beer? Well, let's talk about what I think is probably it's hard to say whether Brett or Lacto is worse, but more people probably do Lacto for sour. So let's talk about sour beers. Lactobacillus and Pediococcus. That's disgusting. Doesn't that sound disgusting? That's the ropey, almost like nasty, moldy stuff that looks moldy, but it's not on your beer. So the primary risk is, of course, the lactic acid that's produced, and that's the lactic bacillus, and then you have the ropiness right from the Pediococcus. So how difficult is it for lactobacillus to infect or contaminate your brewery? Very high, very high. This is the bacteria that's most resistant to standalone iodine-based sanitizers. So of all of these three, lacto sour beers are the most likely to contaminate other parts of your brewery and be very difficult to get rid of. So as far as sanitation, you obviously have very strict sanitation for lacto, dedicated equipment. You might have a boil cycle for boiling things that can be boiled. Chlorine acid rinse as well. Like I said, sometimes it's a good idea to vary your sanitizer so you don't get resistance. All right, Brett, right? Brettanomyces. This is probably the next level down, right? For going from high to say moderate. Brett is, so the primary risk concern with Brettanomyces, instead of souring, it's off flavors, right? We know that Brett tends to be like that barnyard hay horse blanket is how they describe the flavor of a Brett. It's very hyper attenuative over many months. So just like the Saison, it dries out really dry. How difficult is it to contaminate the rest of your brewery? Well, let's move it again from high to moderate. It's a hardy yeast, but its spoilage issue is mainly flavor. So it's not as bad as sour beer, but you know, sanitization is similar, right? You need to use aggressive cleaning, dedicated plastic and rubber, you know, fermenters and parts. It can be difficult to eliminate from small scratches and crevices. Generally would not recommend using this in a keg myself, or using it through your kegerator or keezer, because you're just gonna it's gonna be very hard to get rid of. And then we'll finish this video out real quickly here with the last one that we've been talking about, Saison yeast. Remember, we're talking about the diastatic gene. Not all Saison yeast has a diastatic gene, so check the one you're buying and see if it does or not. And you know what? If you are into that kind of beer, it'd be fun you should try the different yeast to see how the DuPont varies from the French and if a blend works for you. All right, so the primary concern with Saison yeast is very hyper attenuating, right? Meaning it gets super dry, eats all the sugar. You can end up with exploding bottles, kegs. Well, kegs not as much because they have the relief valve, but the problem is it's got a very slow post-packaging fermentation because it's still eating all the dextrins. So keep that in mind, that your Saison is probably going to be right around 1 or even like 998 on the final gravity. If you have like a Saison that's sitting at like 1008, it's probably not done, and you better be careful if you package that. So how difficult is it to contaminate the rest of your brewery? It's relatively easier to kill than, say, Brett or Lacto, like we just talked about. But it can hide in crevices, and it can definitely transfer and cause problems for you. So it's a little easier to deal with, though. To sanitize it, you want to use your standard brewery cleaners, right? Like PBW, or I use OxyClean. And then you want to use really meticulous sanitizer contact. Again, switch out your sanitizer maybe with bleach, and then go back to Star San just to really, you know, get it clean. Focus on bottling and kegging gear, because that's where you're going to have the biggest issue, right? I would say dedicate bottles that you're going to lose, right? When you bottle this, just anticipate whatever bottles you bottle it in, you're not getting it back. Could you use cans? Yes, you could use cans. And I might just do that instead of using bottles, because cans are not going to explode as much. But I don't know. We'll see. I'm just saying, don't reuse the bottles, because the chances of getting them properly cleaned and sanitized so that doesn't transfer. Like I said, if you're going to do this, have a dedicated separate equipment for it. That's it. Sorry it's such a long video. I knew it would be, but I really wanted to go over all of this stuff for Saison yeast, because I am going to be making one, you know, Saison beer coming up, and it's going to be a unique Saison beer that I'm hoping is going to be really interesting and amazing. So we'll find out. I'll see you with that one. I'll be back next week for another video, and until then, keep on brewing. Cheers.